So hopefully you go to church. Most of the folks that listen to my podcast do, I assume. What kind of church do you go to? How old is it? How long has it been around? Ever been to a church that closed? Sometimes churches close. Sometimes they close after 100 years. Sometimes they close after 3. Well, what does that look like? Well, the church closes the doors. Where do all the people go? What happens to your pastor? Is he still a pastor? Those are the things that we're going to talk about in this episode. Welcome to Burnham Podcast. I'm your host, Danny Burnham. A lot of stuff going on. Lots of things happening in my life. You know that I have been for some time now, just over 3 years, the pastor of a church called Rome Reformed Church. Well, as mentioned in the intro, that's changing. So we were a really small church, and we met in a really small space. And as life would have it, people have decided to go separate ways for various reasons. And it had come down to my family and one other family in the church. And we're looking at hanging on to our meeting space and trying to raise the money to pay for that and still be faithful and gather together and do all those things. And you got to look at what point and just say, you know, is it worth it to keep trying to do this? The last thing we needed to do as a church was to miss rent 1 month. We don't need to do that at all, ever. The church doesn't need to go into debt, doesn't need to be delinquent on payments, anything like that. So we weren't going to do that. That was not going to happen. So we have essentially decided to just not gather anymore as Rome Reformed Church. Again, going our separate ways, looking for our own churches. I've got to admit, just being candid here, and other pastors might tell you the same thing, or they might not. I hope that they would be, honest either way. It's sort of a relief. And I felt guilty about feeling that way when I first kind of framed it that way for myself. But the fact of the matter is, being the pastor of a church is exhausting. And we were a small church. It wasn't like we had 10,000 people. Maybe that would have helped if I had, 30 people on staff and an 18-man deacon board and all these different things. We had our elders, and our church was properly structured and all that good stuff. But it was a lot. It was still a lot because you just never knew when your phone was going to ring. And the people that are not part of your church that call you and ask you to do things. But it's being a pastor is just a full-time job. And by full-time, I mean all the time. Of course, I also have my day job. I'm a dad, I'm all these, podcaster, all this stuff that I do. And that was always in at least the back of my mind, being a pastor, doing pastor things. Now, the question is, am I still a pastor? Do I stop being a pastor because I don't have a church anymore? I've talked to a bunch of my pastor friends about this. And they're like, no, you're still a pastor. You just don't have a church right now. You'll get one back one day. I'm like, whoa, let's, pump the brakes a little bit. I just told you that I'm exhausted. Maybe, it's God's will, then it is what it is. I never thought it was going to be God's will for me to be the pastor of a church to begin with. So I can't say, I guess, that it wouldn't be his will for me to do it again at some point, and that's fine. If that's the case, then that is what it is. But looking back at what this has been, we started the church for what I felt like was all the best reasons. We started gathering. If you've listened to the podcast before, you might have heard me tell this story. We started gathering during COVID when churches were shut down. And there was a group of us that understood that you look at a verse like Hebrews 10:25 that tells us not to forsake the gathering. There's no out clause on that. There's no except for. There's people in some third world country right now being murdered for their faith because they chose, to gather against the laws of their country or whatever. So we decided to do that. And we did that for a while, and then churches opened back up, and we all went back to our churches and did that. And then there was a group of us from that group that said, that thing we were doing was kind of cool. It was very organic. It was... we met at a bar because one of the members of the group he owned the bar at the time. And it was the space we could open up in this private space on Sundays, and nobody could really do anything in spite of all the ordinances and stuff like that. So that's what we did. But So this small group of us from within that larger group said, let's explore the possibility of doing that again. And if I had a regret in any of this would be it. It was that there were 3 families involved with the formation of the church, and I was the only biblically qualified elder. Now, I told you a minute ago, our church had elders, and that came later, and that was an absolute priority for me, was to get men in who were biblically qualified elders and could help me lead the church. And so we did that later on, but at first I was it. Well, that was tough. So looking back, if I did have a regret, it would be that we didn't have those elders in place first and a real team to kind of build this infrastructure and put this thing together. And that maybe sounds silly when you're talking about meeting in a bar, or we met in a hotel conference room for a while. But it's either church or it's not, regardless of whether or not it's in a bar or a hotel room or a 10,000 seat, arena, coliseum, whatever Joel Osteen's preaching in these days. But so that was, I wanted to have that structure in place, and we did eventually get it. But I will not start a church again. Maybe I don't start a church ever again, but I won't start another church that doesn't have elders in place from day one and that aren't a part of the process of getting the church going. Again, it was a priority because I didn't want to be the one to just bang the gavel and make the decisions. Like, no pastor should have that, should have the keys to that Ferrari, right? It's supposed to be, the Bible spells this out, how this is supposed to work, and we're supposed to have elders and deacons and all these things. And your church, you're there to help each other. You're there to correct each other. There was nobody to correct me. I could have done whatever I wanted to. Fortunately for my people, I'm a very virtuous man. I'm just kidding. But it could have been just me banging the gavel and making all the decisions, and that was the last thing I wanted. So we were sort of congregational at first, and we would kind of vote on things as a group, as opposed to just waiting on the elders to decide, because, again, I just didn't want that authority. But, yeah, that's kind of, if I had a regret, that would be it. But looking at things now and, from the other side, from the end, and I look back on the we started meeting in April of 21, and it's June of 24 now, so 3 years and, 2 months. I look back now, and I can feel good about the way things went, and I'll be able to sleep and feel good about myself as a pastor and the way that God used me going forward, because I know that I didn't compromise on anything. I did what I thought God wanted us to do with this church. From everything from the message and the way that I structured my sermons down to the structure of the service itself and the order of worship, stuff like that. Didn't compromise on any of that. We sang psalms a cappella from the Bible. I mean, from the Psalter. Was that a thing we did because we felt like we were extra holy after we sang psalms from No. The idea was that none of us knew music, right? We didn't know how to write songs or play songs. I said we were a cappella. We weren't anti-music. We just didn't have anybody who could play. So, we did this because singing straight from the scriptures takes us out of the equation. I don't have to think about, who wrote this and what kind of wackadoodle are they? One of my favorite hymns ever is "It Is Well With My Soul." And that's great. Horatio Spafford wrote that after a terrible time in his life. And half his family died in a shipwreck and all this stuff. And he sings this song, "It Is Well With My Soul." Well, Horatio Spafford would apostate later and started a cult. So, we probably shouldn't sing that song in church. It is what it is. But instead of just running up against wild stuff like that, we just decided to sing from the Psalms. And that was cool. I hadn't experienced that before I started meeting with that group. And once I did, I didn't want to do it any other way. I couldn't imagine why we would do church some other way. If you do church, if you sing different songs in your church, that's fine. I'm not mad at you. We're going to different churches now where they sing different songs. And speaking of different churches, it didn't take any time at all for me to start talking to my pastor buddies and then be like, "Hey, when can you come preach for me?" I'm like, "Bro, give me a minute. Let me catch my breath." I told you, again, I'm exhausted. It's been so hard. People are like, "Well, the preacher only works on Sundays." Well, those people don't know anything at all about church. The preacher works on his sermon all week long. And if he's blessed in that he is a full-time minister, a staff member of the church or whatever, and he's got 8 hours a day to devote to that, that's fantastic, but not all of us do. So we're preparing for sermons on top of all the other stuff we talked about before. And it's just exhausting to be the guy that stands in front of the room every single Sunday and says all the words. It's particularly difficult for me because I don't want to stand up and shake all these hands and talk to all these people. I'm a shy dude. Like big groups of people and up in front, like I guess I fake it really well in that I don't appear that I'm nervous when I get up in front of people and talk. But I'm physically exhausted on a Sunday. After I say amen at the end and step out from behind the pulpit, I am exhausted. And it's because I've been shaking hands and kissing babies and doing all the things that I'm not like wired to do, but I know that God called me to do it, so I have to. So it's just some insight, I guess, on some of the things that your pastors deal with and what they go through on a daily basis. I can be honest about all those things now because I'm not in it anymore. But again, hopefully your guys would be too. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of sad that we put so much time and effort into this, and it's not a thing anymore. But that's our flesh being sad and being upset that this thing that we thought was going to be something, who knows, didn't turn out to be what we thought it was. We didn't start this church with the forethought that, well, one day we'll shut up the doors and, erase the name from the front of the building or whatever. Nobody thinks about that when they're first getting started, but that's us. That's our goals and our hopes and our dreams and things that we are holding on to. God has different plans, and that's okay. Again, I feel good about it. The first thing I kind of thought was, well, I've failed as a pastor, or whatever. And I'm like, well, did I really? Did I fail? I'm sure that I did something wrong, along the way. As far as the ending of the church goes, I don't think there's anything differently that I could have done. Some of this stuff was just life stuff. People moving, living far away and needing to find a church closer to home, stuff like that. Like it wasn't an angry thing or whatever. And even if it were, I wouldn't throw them under the bus on a podcast like this. But yeah, I can live with the way that it's gone. Again, because we didn't compromise. We did what we thought the Lord wanted us to do. And the time just came, man. We got to the end, and we're looking at money, and we're looking at people, and we don't have either. So it's time to move on, and that's okay. That's all right. I'm good with it. I've talked to a bunch of folks about it. We feel good about it. My wife is excited to have me sitting beside her in church now again. That's been kind of nice. I say she's excited. I'm pretty excited about it too, not having to be the guy in front of the room and just sitting with my wife and kids in church. I haven't been able to do that in like 3 years. There was a point when if I couldn't go on a Sunday morning, if I woke up and I was sick, there just wouldn't be church because I was it. I didn't have Elder One or, Plan B or anything. And it's nice to just, at least for a while, not have that on me. Again, I've already been asked by some guys to do fill-ins and things, and I will after, I think, just a couple more weeks. Just give me a little time to breathe and kind of pull myself back together. I don't mind doing some supply pulpit stuff, filling in for guys here and there. I might do an interim in the right circumstance, in the perfect circumstance, and have to be pretty doggone good. But as far as starting a church goes, I don't foresee that ever happening again. Not that I won't be a pastor. I just would hope that God's going to give me another church, that it would be one that's already up and rolling. I think I learned a lot about what a church should be in maybe even some of the things we did wrong. I don't know. But if I could apply those to a church that's already going, I've seen the end of a church now. I've seen how they, and this happened over the course of about 4 days. 3 different families left the church, right, out of the 5, and there weren't many of us, but so it happened just like that. So I kind of saw how things were going. And I've seen the end before, and I like to think I'd be able to see the end coming for another church. So, plugging in somewhere, being part of a staff or even a head pastor somewhere, I think I learned a lot, and that would benefit me in that position if, God sees fit to ever put me there again. And if he doesn't, that's fine. I'll just be faithful and do whatever it is he wants me to do elsewhere, or, whatever. It might not be now. It might be in 30 years. How old will I be in 30 years? I don't want to do that then. But maybe 10 more years. We'll see. We'll see. There's a lot of stuff to do out there. There's plenty of ministry to be done. There's a lot of churches without pastors. And I can't not preach and share the gospel and teach and all those things. So I'll have to find opportunities to do that. And again, they're already kind of finding me. So that's a lot of fun, kind of hashing through those. And we'll see where that goes. But as far as this episode goes, I would just like to say that I love all the folks who have been to our church, the members of our church, folks that have supported us from the outside. It's been a real blessing. It was a great 3+ years. We had good times and bad times and all those things. And I like to feel like we're all better off for it. We've grown in God and all those things. So hopefully I'm not imagining that. Hopefully that's a real thing and folks did benefit from it. But that was the goal when we started. So if we were able to do that and the church closed up the doors anyway, then we were a success rather than a failure in closing up. But that's it. That's where we're going to jump off, and we'll see where God leads. But that's it. God bless you guys. We love you. See you next time.